Okay, so this is a video about why it is that we now live in an era where there are um, a number, certainly more relative to what they used to be, of more nuanced political parties. So, as we know in the United States, it's basically binary. You're either a Republican or a Democrat, and there doesn't seem to be much in the middle. Um, American politics is very polarized in that way. Um, But in our country, it's now completely different. So to what it used to be, because we used to have a similar situation. I mean, when I was a kid, it was Labour or Conservative. Anyone who didn't wish to vote for either of those two voted SDP, Lib Democrats. Um, but they were always in third place. It was really a kind of like a vote for those who were middle of the ground, or a protest vote. And then over the course of time, we've seen UKIP come along, and then that got changed to Reform, and they've been increasing in popularity. We've also got the Green Party, who were at one point a very fringe party, who have won an entire seat in Gorton and Denton in Manchester. Um, and they're on the rise. And we've got the local elections coming up in May, um, where Reform and the Greens are going to get a lot more seats. That is what's predicted. So, and then we've got, what's his name? Rupert Lowe. He's wanting to, I think he's already done it. He's set up his own, like, right wing alternative as well. So my prediction is the next election is probably going to be a hung parliament, but it's going to be what, 3 years away, so it's still a long way off yet. But anyway, why is this the case? Why is politics much more nuanced now? Basically, what happened was in the 1970s with Harold Wilson's government, that government went very far to the left. It got very kind of like socialist, borderline communist, and it created political instability. And the winter of discontent, etc. All these stories about gravediggers going on strike, and bodies piling up, refuse collectors going on strike, rubbish piling up. And I'm not educated enough to know the full ins and outs of that, but I do remember it. I'm old enough to just about remember that. Then what happened was, because we'd gone for so far to the left and the public were sick of that, we then swung dramatically like a pendulum to the right by Margaret Thatcher getting into power in 1979. And she very much was to the right, and it stayed that way for a full 18 years until 1997. And the reason the Conservatives were in power so long is because people had, like, at that point, they were old enough to remember the days of the 1970s, and they didn't want a repeat of how things were under Labour. They didn't trust Labour anymore. However, as with all political parties, once they're in power, the longer they're in power, the more audacious they get with their policies. And then you had the Tories trying to bring in the poll tax in 1990, which was very unpopular to the point where there were actual riots. And then later on, John Major's government wants to bring in VAT on domestic fuel at the rate it was at the time, 17.5%, which would create a massive hike in energy bills. Even then, they had to relent and drop it to half that amount. Well, I think 8.5%, which is what we pay at the moment. So then it was a begrudging concedence that, but we're still paying VAT on having to keep warm and having electricity, essentials. But apparently, that's a perk, that requires VAT. So the Tories were getting, taking liberties to the point where people got sick of them. So in 1997, Labour gets back into power. But the only reason they got back into power was that Labour had to convince the electorate that they weren't hard left, which is why we had Tony Blair Tony Blair was a symbol of that's why they called it New Labour. They reinvented it. So he's very much more towards the middle, barely distinguishable from a Conservative, to be honest, in on reflection. So anyway, so then everyone loves Tony Blair, but then he gets on board with the Iraq War, and then his popularity goes downhill. So then Gordon Brown takes over. Gordon Brown starts dealing out largesse to all and sundry. All the, sells gold at its cheapest, gold reserves at the cheapest price, makes unwise economic decisions like that. Gordon Brown ends up becoming that unpopular that Labour lose that election in 2010, and then the Conservatives get back in again. The pendulum swings back to the Conservatives. So, and the only reason the Conservatives got in was forming they got in by the skin of the teeth by forming, and then only getting into power by forming a coalition with the Lib Dems. So, but then you've got a situation since then where ever since what the Conservative governments that we've had since then, if anything, have started being kind of like coming up with more left-wing policies, quite left-wing in nature. But even they got to the point where they got too unpopular. So then Labour gets in again under Keir Starmer, and the Labour Party have then ended up becoming unpopular with Labour voters because they've made certain decisions that have appeared quite right-wing for a Labour government, particularly around the economic decisions. So people have got frustrated because they're now seeing that Labour and Conservative have almost merged to become one predictable blob that ultimately is still not putting British interests first and taxpayers' interests first. So then you've got the rise of reform that are perceived to be by people who want to vote for them as being popular, being put in British interest first, British taxpayers' interest first. And then you've got the Greens becoming popular with Labour voters who've got disillusioned with the incumbent Labour government and want to vote for something more traditionally left. Because with the Greens, whilst originally it was all about environmental issues, they are closely aligned. They are definitely on the far left of the political spectrum. So they are a kind of a left-wing entity with environmental concerns forming an important part of that umbrella. But this is why we see the rise of fringe parties, because people are now got to the point where they're frustrated with the mainstream. And it's now, the left wing and the right wing vote are now split amongst other parties. But that's all good because, I'm all about democracy and I'm all about choice. So it's good that we have these nuances of right and left. And, we'll see what happens at the next election. But, I'm predicting as it stands at the moment, like I say, a hung parliament. But, if that's the case, then whoever gets the most votes, they'll cobble together with a coalition again. So we'll see what happens.